It was supposed to be just another quiet evening in the suburbs. A peaceful street. Families inside. Porch lights glowing. But that calm shattered when three men, dressed like security officers, confronted a black couple outside their own home. They claimed they were from the neighborhood HOA, but they weren't. Within minutes, a simple argument spiraled into violence when one of the men struck the wife. What those fake cops didn't know was that her husband wasn't just any man. He was a trained Navy SEAL, and what happened next would leave the entire community stunned. Marcus Johnson had always believed in building a good life for his family. A decorated Navy SEAL veteran, he had returned from years of service overseas, hoping for peace, stability, and a safe place where his wife, Angela, could feel at home. They had chosen a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with trimmed lawns, children riding bikes, and neighbors who waved politely as they passed. But underneath that surface of perfection, there were tensions. Marcus knew it, though he tried to ignore it. The neighborhood wasn't as welcoming as it first seemed. There were whispers at HOA meetings, side eyes when Angela walked their dog, and subtle questions about whether they really belonged there. Still, Marcus brushed it off. He had faced far worse in the battlefield. Angela, however, felt it more deeply. She noticed how certain cars slowed when she walked alone, how some neighbors refused to speak to her. But still, she tried to make the best of it, baking cookies for the neighbors and planting flowers in their yard. On that night, Marcus and Angela were simply enjoying the cool evening air, walking back from a friend's house down the block. The streets were calm, the sky filled with stars. But when a black SUV crept up beside them, and three men stepped out in uniforms that looked official, their quiet night began to unravel. The men carried themselves with authority. Black tactical vests, radios clipped to their belts, flashlights shining into Marcus and Angela's faces. They introduced themselves as neighborhood enforcement, claiming they worked for the HOA. But something felt off immediately. Their badges looked generic, their tone aggressive rather than professional. "Where are you coming from?" one of them demanded, ignoring Marcus's calm response. Another man circled Angela, scrutinizing her like she didn't belong. Marcus's instincts sharpened. Years of military service had trained him to read situations quickly, and nothing about this encounter was right. But he tried to stay calm, knowing how quickly things could spiral when you were a black man accused of being out of place. The men accused him of trespassing, even though Marcus and Angela were only a few houses away from their own home. The absurdity of it was clear, but the threat wasn't. These men were feeding off intimidation. When Marcus pulled out his phone to call real authorities, one of the men smacked it from his hand. Angela stepped forward, demanding they back off. She was furious, her voice cutting through the night. And that was when it happened. One of the men struck her across the face with a brutal slap that echoed down the quiet street. For Marcus, time froze. He saw Angela stumble, clutching her cheek, tears welling up from the pain. Rage surged through his body. Every instinct he had honed over years of combat flared alive. These weren't officers. They were imposters, abusers, and now they had crossed the line. But Marcus also knew he had to be precise. One wrong move could escalate this into something deadly, not just for him, but for Angela too. His heart thundered, adrenaline flooding his veins. The street that once felt safe now seemed like a battleground. And as the men closed in, Marcus prepared himself, not as a victim, but as a soldier once more. The first man lunged toward Marcus, but years of Navy SEAL training snapped into action. In a fluid motion, Marcus sidestepped and struck, sending the man crashing to the ground with a forceful blow to the chest. The second assailant charged, but Marcus was faster. He pivoted, hooked the man's arm, and flipped him flat onto the pavement. The crack of impact rang out into the night, followed by groans of pain. The third man hesitated, but only for a moment. Fueled by arrogance, he swung wildly at Marcus. It was a mistake. Marcus ducked, countered with a precise strike to the ribs, and the man collapsed, gasping for air. It all happened in seconds. The same neighborhood that had once ignored Angela's presence was now awake, lights flickering on, blinds twitching, neighbors peering out. Phones started recording, capturing every moment. Marcus stood tall, chest heaving, adrenaline pulsing. Angela was shaken but safe, standing behind him, her cheek red from the strike. The men who had claimed authority now lay sprawled on the asphalt, exposed for what they really were, imposters who thought intimidation and violence would go unchallenged. Sirens echoed in the distance. Someone had called the real police. For Marcus, this wasn't just about self-defense. It was about reclaiming dignity. For too long, people like him and Angela had been told they didn't belong, that they had to stay silent when disrespected. Tonight, Marcus had sent a message loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. They would not be victims. When the real police arrived, the truth quickly unraveled. The three men had no credentials, no legal ties to the HOA, and no authority to stop anyone. Their uniforms were fake. Their intimidation was an act. They were arrested on the spot for assault, impersonating officers, and harassment. Angela pressed her head against Marcus's shoulder as neighbors whispered from their porches, some in shock, others in shame. For the first time, the silent racism that had festered in the neighborhood was exposed in full light. Marcus didn't celebrate. His hands still trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. He had fought wars overseas, but tonight, the battle was in his own backyard. The enemy wasn't in some far-off desert. It was standing in front of him, wearing a false uniform, hiding behind prejudice. Angela's bruise would fade, but the scar of that night would remain. And yet, in the midst of it, there was a shift. The neighbors who once turned away couldn't deny what they had seen. The recording spread. The truth couldn't be silenced. This wasn't just Marcus and Angela's story. It was a reminder of how racism hides in plain sight, dressed in authority, cloaked in respectability, until it lashes out. So the question remains, how many more times must people of color defend their very existence before the world finally admits the problem is real? If you believe stories like this must be told, if you believe silence is no longer an option, then make your voice heard. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so more stories like Marcus and Angela's can reach the world. Because only when we speak up do things begin to change.